Hello, everyone. This is Deacon Peter Loverick from St. Augustine Seminary in Toronto, Canada. I am the professor of homiletics there and also the director of diaconate formation. I am so thrilled and very blessed today to have the opportunity to interview Father Guerric DeBona. Father Guerric DeBona is a Benedictine priest. He is a master preacher. He has written about preaching. One of his most impressive books is Fulfilled in Our Hearing, History and Method of Christian Preaching. And also in particular, I'm going to be speaking about his book of Preaching Effectively, Revitalizing Your Church. It is a book that I've used consistently in my courses on preaching at St. Augustine's, and I highly recommend it. Father DeBona is also novice master of St. Meinrad's Archabbey in Indiana. Father Guerric, thank you for taking your time to speak with us today.
Good to be here, Peter, and thank you for your very flattering introduction. I'm sure I don't deserve any of the things that you said about me.
Spoken like a humble Benedictine. So let's start with your humility, Father. Before we get into your book and into preaching and into some of the questions that the people who subscribe to this YouTube channel, Better Catholic Preaching, would be interested in, let's first talk about you. Could you tell us about how you ended up as a Benedictine priest? How did that vocation come about?
It's a question that comes up, of course, all the time when, especially in the seminary context, and also for any of our visitors who visit the monastery. I grew up in a Benedictine parish on Long Island in New York. It was run by a staff that was all the way from St. Leo's Abbey, believe it or not, in Florida, which was a foundation of St. John's. And I was fortunate enough to come under the direction of especially the pastor, who was an extremely talented musician and very interested in first beginning a boy choir that would specialize in chant for the parish. And then we went on to become a concert choir. So I learned, at first he hired a student who was a student of Zoltan Kodály. His name was Arpad Daraj. And then a few years later, the head of the conductor of the Vienna Boy Choir was on a kind of a leave. And for 3 years, he took over the choir. So we had a variety of contexts for music, liturgical certainly, many sung funerals, high masses, concerts, and so on. And that was how I spent my 3rd grade to 8th grade. And it was a very rich liturgical experience. The pastor himself, Father Raphael, was a very talented preacher. And so I think the one thing that I would say about my life, my early life that led to my vocation, is that it was a very liturgical, formative life that was highly integrated in all aspects. Certainly catechesis, when it came to learning in the school part of it with the Dominican nuns who came over from Regensburg. And then there was also the daily choir practice of 2.5 hours. And so it was quite a disciplined sort of life. But when I went to high school, which was a Marianist school, Chaminade in Mineola, New York, I found myself putting together a lot of the things that I experienced as, I guess I would say, an emerging spiritual person. And so when I eventually, right after college, or more or less after college, I came to St. Meinrad, it fulfilled a kind of space that had been, I would say God had planned for me because of the way I was my parents are very religious. My environment was religious, and I wanted to live that out because it felt right. And so I've been here at St. Meinrad for 40 years. And I would describe myself as a very happy person. And that was part of my journey. And I think part of the, with everybody's journey, it's always going to be in the context of others, of course, and community. So I'm grateful for the people that helped me along the way, just too numerous to mention. But there were other people in my choir days, in my high school days, who also found a similar religious vocation. One became a Carmelite. Many of the folks that were involved in the choir eventually became professional musicians. And so there was a lot going on there that I just would describe as unique. And so I will always be grateful for all of that formation.
You've spoken about the importance of discipline and music in your youth, and both discipline and music are, especially chant, are so important to the Benedictine charism, to the Benedictine way of life. But how did this focus now become on preaching?
Well, when after I was ordained, I was, because I had a master's in English, I was assigned for 3 years to teach in our seminary college full-time. And then I went away for a doctorate in English literature at Indiana University. When I returned, the college had to be closed for financial reasons. And so I was asked to join the faculty in the School of Theology in the preaching department. And they gave me a year of postdoctoral studies in rhetoric and also some preaching with collaboration that I learned mostly from 2 people who became good friends with me, Father Jim Wallace, who was a Redemptorist, and who also, if you remember, he joined our group some years ago when you held that lovely conference at St. Augustine's. And then the late Father Bob Wozniak, who was a Sulpician. And those two, together with the work I was doing in rhetoric at Catholic University for a year, really helped shape me to bring in what I had done in my graduate studies in English literature into this new discipline. So I wouldn't have expected that I was going to take that particular journey. I would not describe myself as a fantastic preacher or anything like that. But I do think that it was very helpful, again, to have the background that I did, which enabled me then to take on the responsibilities of teaching seminarians and people who are training for the permanent diaconate.
Wozniak, Wallace, and DeBona. That's a very powerful combination.
Right.
Let's talk about how this book, Preaching Effectively, Revitalizing Your Church, and the subtitle is The 7-Step Ladder, which I think comes from St. Alain de Lille.
Yes, there are, in the history of spirituality, there are all sorts of these ladders. There's Guido, and of course, probably the most famous and the one that I would be most familiar with would be from the 7th chapter of the Benedictine Rule. And Benedict himself draws that, of course, from the biblical image of Jacob's ladder. So it's a very well-grounded, this idea of the ladder is a very important term in spirituality. And I drew that metaphor principally because what I was hoping to do with the seminarians, and then for people who are just learning how to preach, is help to develop an integrated system where they would be able to build on foundations one after the other. And when I first began preaching, the resources that I could find, some of them were quite good, but a lot of them really focused on what I guess I would call incidental tips or scattered information of how to get your assembly's attention, or how to do this, this, and this. All that is great, but at what point do you say, I'm lacking this and I need to build on that? So that's why I thought the latter would be a good idea, because it also works not only if you are already ordained, or you can't meet every week like a seminary student, but it also helps when you can grab hold of that initial principle, which I'm always stressing to the seminarians, and that is, what is your theology of preaching? If you don't have a theology of preaching, then my question would be, what are you working out of when it comes to the homily preparation, when it comes to prayer over the homily? What is the ground that is informing your preaching? Otherwise, it seems to me you are always going to be left with, well, this is one of the jobs that I do. And another question that my colleague and I, Dr. Stern, continually ask the students, and that is, how many people decided to become a priest because they heard the call to preaching? And amazingly, and this would be true for me too, one person, maybe two in the class would say yes. Invariably, the non-Catholics are absolutely at the other end of the spectrum, because my Protestant colleagues are always telling me they heard the call to preach, their own colleagues heard the call to preach, and that's why they went into ministry. So there's an initial response there that they can return to. And so my thought with developing a theology of preaching is, what's the groundwork that's going to drive you? And after all, the call that the ordinary speaks to the candidate at ordination is, the priest's first task is to preach the gospel. And so if that is the backbone of our ministry, what are we going to live out of when it comes to that experience?
Preaching is the primary apostolate, as Pope Paul VI would say, or it comes out of Trent as well. We have several courses in preaching at St. Augustine's, but in the first course, the Intro to Homiletics, there's no preaching at all, because I don't want the students walking into a pulpit without having thought through the basic questions and developed a theology of preaching and knowing why they are doing something or why they are not. One of the great, I mean, you speak about a foundation for your book. One of the wonderful things about your book, which I'm recommending to any listeners of this video, is that there are a lot of books out there which remain at a very abstract or theological level, but yours brings that in, but then brings it down to what we're supposed to do in our homilies, brings it down to something concrete and specific. You have steps and missteps, for example, at the end of every chapter. Having said what you said about the purpose of this book, could you stand back and do a sort of diagnosis of the state of Catholic preaching today? What most needs attention to? What is the biggest issue, or if you want to frame it in terms of the problem, or what is the biggest thing that Catholic preaching needs to take care of today?
It's a good question, Peter. From my perspective, I think the difficulty that anybody is going to have, especially at the initial stages of preaching, is attending to the listener. And there again, I would point to the theology that needs to be at the center of this, and that is the theology that Jesus himself gave us, which is himself opening up the scriptures in Luke chapter 4, where he says that this passage has been fulfilled in your hearing. So here we have the Word himself, who is the fulfillment, telling the congregation that that fulfillment is going to happen in their hearing. So in my mind, unless we are preaching in a way that allows the baptized assembly to connect with the reality of the Word made visible, I don't think we've done our job. So my first recommendation is exegeting the assembly so that you have some idea who it is that you are speaking to. And that exegesis should happen at the most basic level. So I tell my students, you can't only focus on the exegesis of the biblical readings, although that would be my second point when it comes to the preparation that needs to be done that is almost, well, can be lacking in a lot of preaching. And not to signal out the Catholics only, because there's a lot of preaching out there that has what I would say devolved into what I would call therapeutic. And Harry Emerson Foster was pushing this stuff in the 1920s and 30s, because of the rise of certain kinds of media and certain kinds of ecclesial structures, Jesus has fallen out of the picture in many of these instances. And so if you attend to the listener, you're preaching to the baptized assembly, knowing that they, in your presence, are, as Sacrosanctum Concilium tells us, the presence of Christ gathered. And so too is the presence of Christ in the biblical readings when it comes to discovering what those are, praying over what those are. And then the third thing that should allow both of these two things to flourish is discover a homiletic method that is going to be a kind of an armature, so that you're unpacking the readings for the sake of the listener, and that this process becomes unfolded to them. One of the difficulties that we will always face when we preach is that from the very early stages of our lives, we've been taught to write as individual persons. That's not a bad thing, but we're writing usually for ourselves and perhaps for one other person, a reader. But the experience of preaching, as you know, and that as you have taught so well in your school, is that you're talking to a group mind, which is processing information at a very different level than if you were simply communicating by a meditation or something along those lines. That has its own place, some kind of reflective meditation. But can you discover a method that's meant for a group hearing, that's allowing the assembly to begin to unpack what the readings are, so that underneath it all, they're really saying, tell me more about that. Can you say something else? Oh, I didn't know that. And then eventually move towards inviting them towards some sort of a response, which is lift up your hearts. On that level, I think we have to be extremely attentive again to the listener. What are the readings that are going to deepen the faith of the assembly? And then that method that's especially going to be a focus that will allow the congregation to say, this is what I emerged from this experience with this particular challenge. One sentence, can I speak that back?
Very powerful. So you, on page 17 of your book, you summarize that. You say, a listener-centered spirituality of preaching recognizes the God-given mission to strengthen the faith of the assembly. And what you've just told us is one way of doing this is, we all know about exegesis of scripture, that's been taught over and over again, but not to forget there should also be exegesis of congregation.
Yes.
And yet in the middle of that, you were reminding us that at the same time that we focus on our listener, that we don't forget that our preaching is Christocentric, that it is focused on Christ. Now, this leads though to a question that many preachers have asked me, and that have come through our forums. And you raise this in your step 5 of your book. In step 5, step 5 is titled Communicating in Contemporary Culture, and also You also talk about globalizing the homily in the next chapter. How do we keep a homily listener focused, attending to the needs of the people in front of us with such diverse congregations? I give you an example here. In Toronto, uh, in our city, 51%, if not more, of the people who live here were not born even in Canada, not even born in our country. We have 140 languages running here, and we have mass in 36, 38 languages going on. And so, a seminarian, what we talk, I will speak to the seminarians about the need to do the exegesis and to attend to the needs of the listener, not what they want, but what they need. And then they ask, well, how do I do that when I walk in? And I have this, it's not I have a Hispanic congregation or it's a Chinese population. I have absolutely the whole world and all ages and everything all together. How do we handle that as preachers, Father?
I think one of the people that I would look at as a very good guide here would be Pope Francis himself, because in that wonderful section on the homily in Evangelium Gaudium, he talks about keeping an ear to the people and the absolutely critical task of being a pastor while you are preaching. And so the question here, I think we need to back up when it comes to preaching to the assembly and ask ourselves, is there anything different that I would be attending to in preaching that I wouldn't be attending to on other circumstances with this population? If I'm ministering to them at the hospital, if I'm ministering to them at the school, I'm still dealing with diversity. And so that reality is going to be complicated because you're communicating in a larger assembly. But the challenge, and I think the creative challenge, is how can I help form them as an ecclesial community? Not how can they understand me, but how can I form them into this one body of Christ? And that, I think, cannot only happen in the 7 to 8 minutes at the homily. It has to happen in the process of your pastoring, but also with your team, your pastoral team. How are you communicating catechetically in the course of the rest of the week with what's going on in dialogue with the world, what's going on with the church's teaching, and so on? And it reminds me of this whole issue of biblical illiteracy and biblical or religious illiteracy that Stephen Prothero talks about, because it's not just the diversity of people, it's that they are educated in diverse ways too. As you know, and as I'm a product of it, I grew up in what we might call a feeder system, where by the time I got to high school, questions about religious vocabulary were already inscribed in my DNA, as it were, from my home that I grew up in, from the schooling, and so on. So how can catechetical teams, preaching teams, in the course of the week deal with this diverse community and so recreate vocabulary, recreate metaphors? The metaphor of the ladder is what I use to talk about preaching, but there are lots of other language systems. Some of them need to be rediscovered. And so can the team do this so that the building occurs? And is there a pastoral plan for preaching in place? So asking ourselves, where do I want this diverse congregation at the end of Advent? Where do I want this diverse congregation at the end of Lent? Where do I want them at the end of Easter? These are very creative questions that don't stop just with the preaching at the ambo, but actually moves out and begins to ask the question over and over again that Fulfill in Your Hearing posed, and that is, are we deepening the faith of the baptized? And so deepening the faith of the baptized is going to happen in the midst of diversity. It's inevitable. but it's going to be a process if you allow it to be so.
Father, you speak about deepening the faith of the baptized. You spoke a moment ago about preaching to the congregations. I mean, it's clear what we're talking about in homiletics. It's not like initial proclamation out on a street corner to the masses. We're talking about preaching to the family, you know, people who are already part of the family. And you raise in your book very, very early on and you've just alluded to it now, the problem where at one time we could expect the family to share a certain vocabulary and a certain sense of story, but you then talk about the loss of the meta narrative, and you refer to the Pew Forum survey, Religious Literary Survey 2007, which says that we're becoming a nation of religious illiterates. And you say very powerfully on page 35, increasingly, speaking the scriptures has become more and more difficult in preaching because of a culture of general biblical illiteracy and fragmentation. So, if our homilies, if our preaching is supposed to be, as all the documents, the homiletic directory and everything says, to be based on and through and from the scriptures of that Mass, how does a preacher dealing with preaching the scriptures, knowing that he can no longer assume? There was I think it was from your book, I'm not sure now, I've forgotten, or it was from another, but there was a wonderful observation that was made where they discovered in a congregation that some of the people thought that Sodom and Gomorrah were brother and sister. Was that okay?
I wish I had said that.
So it just, we can't even assume that the names and the places, which, as you say, in your experience and in mine, are just part of our DNA, is no longer there. How do we deal with the meta-narrative now?
In my reading, Peter, I think the meta-narrative of salvation history is of utmost importance, because when I think about St. Paul, for instance, who in a sense would have been lost without a meta-narrative, and who himself relies so crucially on the passing on of memory to another. I handed on to you what was handed on to me as a matter of first importance, that Christ Jesus died according to the scriptures. That is the mandate for the meta-narrative. And so can we, in the course of the, again, process during the week, help people to come to terms with this vocabulary? Because the Sunday Eucharist should be the place where the church sets the reset button for people who are coming in from a kind of existential loneliness, being awash with questions and awash with all certain things. The meta-narrative of salvation history should give them comfort that God has a plan for them. So if our job is to restate that at each Eucharist on Sunday, if that is our function through preaching, and that the liturgy of the Eucharist itself, because of what it does in anamnesis to recall the memory of the Lord's Supper, if that's the case, we need to build during the week to allow that vocabulary to be reinstated and flourish again in creative ways. Are we doing these kinds of things with our, with the children when it comes to perhaps video games or catechetical lessons that are focusing on that when it comes to adult study groups? All of those things, in my reading anyway, can only help to flourish. Social media can be of enormous help here in terms of setting up a kind of dialogue if your team is engaged in that kind of thing with the congregation. And so again, the homily doesn't stop on Sunday. It moves and pushes through to build so that this literacy becomes something that every parish can lay claim to. and learn differently. Again, when there's no feeder system, you have to recreate the feeder system in a sense by micro feeder systems in each parish, so that there is a common vocabulary, there is something that people will be drawn to at the Sunday Eucharist.
You say in your book that all of this attention to the listener, all of this attention to being Christocentric in your preaching, all of this attention to creating the meta narrative and to meeting the needs of the questions that the people are bringing. You say all of this starts with a first step, which, not surprisingly from you, comes from, you say, chapter 7 of St. Benedict's Rule. And that first step, you say, is vigilance to God's presence at all times and in all places. Could you explain what that means for the preacher?
Well, what I think, what I would say about that, Peter, is that I think Benedict would ask all of us to be attentive to the ladder of humility. He's not, the rule was not designed for some specialized group of people that, the monastic movement started out not as a clerical order. It wasn't even an order because it's so ancient. It began with the most fundamental portion of the human subject, and that is, who am I as a creature, and how do I respond to my Creator? So I think we need to recognize that reality as a preacher, because that's really what I'm preaching out of. I am giving voice to my creative self back to the one who created me, and helping others to do the same. So I included that there because it's a necessary component. It is a piece that must be there, because that is who we are, in the sense that every theological anthropology has to start from a ground of being. And where am I grounded? This is the God of all things, everything. So how do I preach, not as therapeutic suggestions, or as, there's a certain group of people years ago, and believe me, this was done out of every good will, but they thought it was their function to comment on each of the readings and kind of give a commentary. And a lot of that is good information, to have those sorts of things. But these days, people can find that on the internet. They don't need that. Are you giving the congregation an experience of God where they can speak back through Christ a word to the Father? That happens if we can only fundamentally recognize ourselves as creatures that are always in the presence of God, and not just on Sunday, but every day and every moment.
You speak about recognizing ourselves as a very important first step. Could you then tell us how that works with a quotation you give us from St. John Henry Newman, where St. John Henry Newman tells us, or tells preachers, that they need to be self-forgetful. What does it mean for me to be self-forgetful as a preacher? How does that play out in my homily?
When I think about that particular aspect of preaching, I'm often reminded of, I think it was Charles Wesley, when people asked him how he could preach so powerfully. He said, well, I really don't know, but I go up to the pulpit, I catch on fire, and people watch me burn. It's a little bit like that when it comes to being self-forgetful. There's no excuse for lack of preparation, because the Spirit is there. And to the extent that we prepare ourselves and under the guidance of the Spirit will be the extent to which we will lay claim to that word when we preach. And so I would say that when it comes to preaching, certainly our own humanity should be revealed in a kind of transparency, which does not show any trace of artifice or pretension or any of the things that I would normally associate with a fragile ego, but rather the self-forgetfulness that says, I have relied on the Spirit, and I'm speaking here through the Spirit, and I'm here to do God's mission through Christ. So that is why I do this, and that's what I'm doing. Again, I would come back to my theology of preaching recommendation at the very get-go, which is I'm not really giving pastoral advice. I'm not really giving instructions on what happens in the readings. I am preaching, which is a very different thing from instructing, from all of the, at least when it comes to the liturgical homily. There is a place for apologetics. There is a place for street preaching, and Catholics do have a history of street preaching that came in the was taken from the evidence guilds that came out of Wilfrid Sheed's preaching in London. In the 20s and 30s, there were evidence guilds that went all over the country preaching in rural areas and streets. Those were apologetic preachers. They were there to explain and help clarify the Catholic faith. Liturgical preaching has another task. It's deepening the faith of the baptized. And so if that's the case, then the preacher's task has to be illuminating what he can only do through God.
You spoke earlier today that to accomplish this preacher's task of illumination, that method was very important. Mm-hmm. And you spoke, and certainly Saint Francis de Sales spoke of, or wrote of, how method above all is most important in a preacher's practice. And in your book, you speak of many methods. You write of Scott Wilson's Paul Scott Wilson's 4-page preaching, the four-page sermon. You speak about Eugene Lowry's loop, David Buttrick's moves, and so on. When it comes to your preaching, what do you end up tending to favor? What is your default? Do you like Paul Scott Wilson's 4-page homily mostly, or Eugene Lowry's the loop, or something else? What do you default to?
I tend to, when it comes to those guys, and they're all giants in their field. Paul, your fellow Canadian, brilliant teacher. We've had him here give talks to the students in the seminary. Students love him. I would not favor one over the other, but it would depend on what the readings are. Because just to give you an example, Paul has a very, very, very useful quadrant when it comes to this 4 pages of preaching. And the first of these is finding trouble in the text. Mm-hmm. So if you are going to find trouble in the text, there's first of all, there's a rhetorical strategy at stake here. I'm finding trouble. Many people that come in to listen to the homily thinks that the preacher is going to explain something to me. And when you start identifying the trouble, they're very surprised. And he'll go on to link that with trouble in the world. And so if I'm finding a biblical passage, let's say Genesis 22, about the so-called binding of Isaac, which is what the rabbis used to refer to that, that's a very troubling passage for lots of people. I would say everybody. How could God ask for such a thing? So there's trouble in that text. How do you untie that knot becomes the issue of the rest of the homily that's going to keep your folks glued to your text. There he has a very wonderful way of unfolding it, because if there's trouble in the text, if there's trouble in the world, the second piece of this is, okay, where's the good news in the text? Where's the good news in the world? That is a kind of, if you will, the other shoe that has to drop, because the problem is first of all recognizing that I don't have any shoe on my one foot, so I better, what does it mean to drop the other shoe. Or as I like to call it when I'm with the students, you're loading a mousetrap at the beginning. How effective is your tension when you are loading this? Is it as effective as a mystery novel, which at the very get-go is starting to set up questions that will unleash scripture for the congregation so that they can say collectively to themselves, oh, so that's it. It's about this. That becomes, again, crucial when it comes to the method that Paul is using. But on some level, this narrative preaching, when it comes to these methods with Lowry and also with the late David Buttrick, all rely on some level with allowing the people to unfold the homily as a collective unit.
Therefore, would it be fair to say that you tend more to the inductive model rather than the deductive model?
Yes, absolutely. I think, again, there's a place for the deductive model, but I would say that my preference, and this is the preference that Fulfilled in Your Hearing also suggests, because of the way in which people are processing information today. And they are, I know someplace, Eugene Lau, or maybe it might be Fred Craddock, also another giant, talks about people don't think in terms of calfhood. They think of a small brown calf that has just, been born. So it's the specifics of human life that eventually lead to a general principle or conclusion. The deductive method works from the opposite way, which is, here's the general principle. Let's move from that to some other kind of conclusion. And given the way in which story is functioning in our culture, which is very important, given the reality of the concrete that is so important for everybody to begin to understand, I think the induction model is certainly an important one that doesn't give preachers the license to go on rambling and just simply talk about the vacation that they had because that was fun and so on. There has to be a strategy. And so if you're going to use induction, make sure that it is functioning as an armature for the homily that's going to move the congregation to the conclusion you want them to, so that they are on your page all the way.
So let's then talk about, let's get very specific with you.
Mm-hmm.
You get an assignment. You are asked to preach the following Sunday. It's today's Sunday, and then you're asked to preach the following Sunday. What does Father Guerric DeBona do in preparing his homily? What's your method from start to end?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that I would do, Peter, is very early in the week before I preach that following Sunday, I would pray over the readings. And what I mean by praying over the readings is that first I would just give the readings a good read, the way I would read, anything fairly carefully. Go back and read it again. I often suggest to others as well that they read them out loud. And that's a practice that I like to get into so that I'm hearing it. I become in a sense, the first hearer of the congregation when I'm preaching, because I'm just one of them, but I happen to hear the gospel first. And so this is sort of in a literal way what I'm doing. Then my tendency after that is to start a kind of what I call a loose dialogue process, both with myself and what I might sense is going on around me, being attentive to the signs of the times, asking myself, okay, this particular weekend, if I'm preaching at the Archabbey Church, what groups are going to be here this coming weekend? If I'm at a parish assignment, I'll immediately start asking myself or go on the internet and ask, what about the churches in Indianapolis? I happen to be closer with the priests up in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, but Occasionally, I might go to a parish in Evansville or Louisville. And what kind of parish is this? Is it partially Hispanic? Is it a working class parish? Is it a parish where there's a high income level? How are they? What is the group that I'm going to be dealing with? This is as close as I can come to exegeting the assembly. So I call this a loose dialogue process because I'm not writing much down here. I'm just in conversation, loose conversation with myself. I may start writing loose ideas about, okay, you know, what do I want to be attentive to? How about, you know, if it is, for instance, the reading on the parable of the folks that are hired the last in the vineyard, there's a challenge to an economic system with that. So how are various income levels going to hear that parable? They're going to hear it differently depending on where they're from. By the middle of the week, I'm going to start a more formal process of dialogue and open some commentaries. Really start looking at maybe some of the patristics may have looked at in terms of how they preached it. What did St. Augustine do? If it was a parable, he's got tons of stuff on what he's done with certain parables and so on. But modern commentaries, very big on looking at what contemporary biblical scholarship has done. But towards the end of that work week, on Thursday, I certainly would begin to start sketching out an outline and start looking at what that might be. And then certainly by Friday afternoon, I'd start actually writing out a text. And then I'd write the text. And then on Saturday, I would go back to what I wrote and ask myself, does this still ring true? Now, I tend to always use a manuscript or write a manuscript by and large. But if I am going to a parish, I will often shift to an outline, but still write a manuscript. So because the usefulness of shifting to an outline is you can ask yourself, does all this hang together so that I'm moving from this to this to this to this, and are they following me? When I say this, how will they respond? I often use the image here of, and some people may push back at this, but I think it's, at least in my mind, it's true. The image of the preacher is much more like a playwright than somebody who is giving a speech of some other kind, because you have to have in mind what your language is doing to people. This is one of David Buttrick's great insights among many, and that is, as a phenomenologist, his utmost concern was, what is the gospel doing, not what does it mean? And David taught here for 10 years, and I happily took a class from him. When such a moment occurs, when we are faced with the reality of the doing of language, I think we can really begin to grasp what our preaching is supposed to do. It's not supposed to mean, it's supposed to do, it's supposed to form. It is not a question, ultimately it's a question of the congregation making meaning out of what you are doing with language. But poetry functions this way. All poetic language in the end is formative. And so Jesus himself, as the Word made visible, came to form and to reform, and still does. That's a separate question from making meaning. And that's probably what the disciples missed most often, because they were trying to get him to tell, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? And he throws back at them a formational question. And that comes as a shock, because we're so used to asking, practical people that we are, what does this mean? Well, maybe there's another question here when it comes to our language.
You speak about a process where you are contemplating, engaging the text in prayer, and then you consult different
Mhm.
sources, and then you make it an important part of your preparation to actually write the whole thing out to be sure that you can find all the words. But then you say, on the Saturday or wherever, you look at it to see, does it really hang together? Does it need to be, and then, or perhaps you turn it into an outline, in which case, again, this connects to something it's a wonderful phrase that you quote in the book. You say a preacher really needs to be able to murder his darlings.
Yes.
Could you tell us what does murdering your darlings mean and how you do that, or how can I do it?
Well, I may be getting the reference wrong, but my memory tells me that the phrase itself comes from Euripides' play Medea, where Medea, having helped Jason, her new husband, to the Golden Fleece, escapes. They set up a housekeeping together and have two children, and he eventually takes up with another woman. Well, because she's a witch, she wants to get back at him in the most economical way possible. And so first thing she does is weave a golden dress for his mistress, which when she goes into the mistress goes into the sun, it bursts into flame. The second thing she does is murder her children. And she knows that by murdering her darlings, she is going to cut to the core of getting back at him and revenging. Now, we're not about revenge, of course, in our preaching, but we are about economy of language. And so if we're looking for the most economical thing to do when it comes to preaching, there are some phrases that people so dearly want to hang on to, or they just think the congregation is dying to hear about this particular thing that I thought up. I tell the students, write it down in an index card and file it away and save it for another day when you can use it more effectively in the homily. Don't just throw it in there, because the biggest complaint that people have about preaching when it comes to listening to them is that there is too many things going on. There are too many ideas. They're not connected. The late Bishop Ken Untner said this in his own research in his book, that they're convinced that the preacher has some really good ideas, but they're not integrated with one another. They're just sort of floating all over the place. And then like a cracking fortune cookies open and just scattering them. In the end, people are not going to come away with much because they're not connected in any coherent way. Can you murder your darlings becomes the sobering, very ascetical discipline that says, I don't have to have everything. This can wait.
Your images of murdering darlings, or particularly now cracking fortune cookies open. This is the language of preaching that we're meant to have, really concrete images that stay with us. Father Guerric, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful. Your depth of experience and your reading and your own practice in preaching is just a treasure for all of us. Thank you so much for doing this interview. God bless you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Very nice to be here, and thank you for asking me, Peter.
God bless.
Thanks.